Sir, please go ahead. Be live. Sir, please go ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ASSOCHAM webinar on gaining market autonomy, an era of reduced dependence on China. Today, we have a very power-packed panel of experts from industry, from research, and from the media. The objective of this discussion today is to brainstorm on how India can achieve its goal of becoming a self-reliant India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, the clarion call by our Honorable Prime Minister. And we are deeply honored to have two key speakers for the program today. We have Mr. Sanjay Chadha, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, and Mr. Jayant Das Gupta, Foreign Trade Specialist, former Indian Ambassador to the WTO. Thank you for joining us and thank you for giving us your precious time. Friends, we have with us the moderator, Mr. Anand Krishnan. I would like to briefly introduce Mr. to all of you. With the Hindu, and he has a former visiting fellow at Brookings India Institute. He was also the China Bureau Chief at the Associate Editor for the India Today Group based out of Beijing until August 2018. Mr. Krishnan reported out of China for 9 years for India Today as well as earlier with Hindu newspaper starting in June 2009. Mr. Krishnan has been closely tracking China-Indian relations for over a decade now. His reporting has taken him to all but 3 of China's 33 provinces and regions. He has interviewed China's premier, foreign minister, defense minister on India-China relations. He has widely reporting on China's neighborhood diplomacy with a focus on Beijing's engagement in South Asia and has since its unveiling in 2013. He has been appearing on Indian television on all matters relating to India-China relations, India's diplomacy. Krishna's interests include Tibet and Xinjiang, and he has traveled extensively in China across various regions. So over to you, Mr. Krishnan, to take this interesting discussion forward.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. I think it's a really interesting topic. There isn't a more relevant one on many people's minds right now after the COVID-19 pandemic and with the events on the boundary. And I think we're all looking at our dependencies with China, our vulnerabilities, and asking what we can do about it. We have a lot of ground to cover. Just a few rules about the event. We have 9 members on our panel, so I'll first invite all of them to get us started with a few observations. I request them all to keep it brief, to not more than 5 or 6 minutes, so we have time for questions, and we've already received several dozen questions. I request everyone to keep their screens on mute, so there isn't interference when other people are speaking. With that, let us get us started. I request A. Gururaj to first welcome all of us and set the stage for the discussion. He is the current chairman of ASSOCHAM's Karnataka Manufacturing Committee. He's a veteran in the manufacturing industry and has been involved in many MNC investments in India in a number of sectors ranging from automotive to electronics. So I think Mr. Gururaj is somebody who is in a good position to give us a good context for today's discussions. So over to you, please. Please unmute.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Anand Krishna. Good morning, everyone present. On behalf of Mr. Deepak Sood, Secretary General ASSOCHAM, who could not be here today, it's a pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this very important webinar being organized by ASSOCHAM. We are grateful to Mr. Sanjay Chadha, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, Mr. Jayant Das Gupta, Foreign Trade Specialist and former Indian Ambassador to the WTO, and the elite and distinguished panel of industry experts from research think tanks and prominent industry associations for being here with us despite the busy schedules. I present below our thoughts as ASSOCHAM on the subject of the webinar. India and the world economy are undergoing a critical phase due to the onslaught of COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses across the globe are reeling under stress and business discontinuity due to this global pandemic. Today's webinar, Gaining Market Autonomy, an Era of Reduced Dependence on China, aims to trigger a discussion among the experts on the strategy to build a resilient and self-reliant India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. The necessity of this thought has been triggered because of the serious impact of COVID-19 on the Indian industry, as well as businesses across the globe due to the disruption in the global supply chain. Companies across the globe were dependent primarily on one country, China, for the need for raw materials or finished products. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of many organizations, especially those who have had a very big dependence on China. China is known to be the world's factory, and this pandemic has taught us a valuable lesson that any major disruption in China's manufacturing system puts the global supply chain at risk. According to Dun & Bradstreet, 51,000 companies have one or more direct suppliers in Wuhan, while 5 million companies have one or more two-tier suppliers in the same region. This year, 2020, marks the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between India and China. It was meant to be a year of celebration. But first the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the unfortunate clash in Ladakh, where 20 of Indian Army personnel lost their lives, have exposed the tragic irony of these plans. Following the clash in Ladakh, anti-India sentiments in China are at an all-time high, with people calling for boycott of Chinese products in the country. Recently, FDI norms for investors from China has been tightened, 59 Chinese apps banned on grounds of national security, and Indian government has also announced that Chinese companies would not be allowed in highway projects, and Chinese imports have been stuck for longer periods at ports and airports across the South Asian countries. However, since India's exposure to China is asymmetric in terms of trade and investment, it will be difficult for India to suddenly sever or reduce trade and economic ties with its neighbor. Now, the question in the minds of most people is the extent to which the Indian economy can decouple from China. Is it possible in the foreseeable future? Over the last 2 decades, India-China economic relations have grown substantially, with trade volume reaching US $88 billion in 2018-19 fiscal year. However, the trade is heavily favored on the Chinese side. India recorded a massive US $53.5 billion deficit with China, the biggest trade deficit India has with any country in the world. A closer look at the facts provides a clear picture as to where India stands vis-a-vis dependence on China. An important point is that China had established itself as India's largest import source from 2004-05. Over the next decade, China's expansion in the Indian market continued, and by 2017-18, China's share had expanded to 16.4%. In the 2 financial years since, the share dropped to 14%. However, there is evidence that China's presence has certainly not decreased. There are 2 major sectors in which India's dependence on China is particularly strong and to some extent worrying. Electronic products, including telecommunication equipment, paramount in these days of pandemic, and active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, the intermediates for manufacturing pharmaceutical formulations. Both these sectors are immensely significant for India. While the former is critical for the government's Digital India program, the latter supports India's pharmaceutical industry that supplies affordable medicines to the domestic market and several developed and developing countries. China's export to India in 2019 was US $68 billion, and India's exports to China is US $16.96 billion. Currently, 40% of India's imports are high value added items and products like electronic items, medical instruments, etc. China has been one of the most important sources of foreign direct investments in India. According to the Commerce and Industry Ministry, FDI from China stood at a total of 1.8 billion between 2015 and 19. India has become a major destination for Chinese investments, with key Indian startups like Zomato, Paytm having received millions of dollars worth of funding from China. The total planned and current Chinese investments in India are estimated to be about 26 billion US dollars, according to the US think tank Brookings. That India should bring its own dependence on China is a no-brainer, or India should bring down its dependence on China is no-brainer. There is no easy pathway for India to reduce its current dependence, and decoupling from China will be a slow and gradual process. But progress towards reducing this dependence only be made if the government and businesses make concerted efforts. In some sectors, especially in the production of APIs, the government will have to play a more proactive role by using the public sector units, as 3 decades of growth of the Indian pharmaceutical industry has shown that the private sector is not willing to invest in a segment that involves considerable risk taking. In other words, only a carefully crafted industrial policy can reduce India's dependence on China. India can play an important role in helping the world bounce back faster from the pandemic. We must build a stronger domestic economic capability. The crisis has caught us and the importance of local manufacturing by surprise, but has also showed to us the importance of local manufacturing, local market, and local supply chains. Could COVID-19 be the black swan event that finally forces companies in India and across the globe to rethink and transform their global supply chain model? Could India become the global supply chain value chain provider to global business? What immediate policy support does the Indian industry need from the central government to make it happen for catering to the domestic and international markets? To discuss this further, we have an excellent panel of speakers from the government and industry. Our expert panel will enlighten us on the pros and cons of disengaging from China. What should be the right strategy to proceed towards this, and what are the alternatives available for India? On the back of extensive reforms unleashed by the Indian government, which offers extensive opportunities to invest in a variety of sectors in India, Indian industry will join its might to support the government in its efforts to play a significant role in the global economic integration. ASSOCHAM supports the clarion call by the Honorable Prime Minister for an Atmanirbhar Bharat and vocal for local. Let us together make India prosper for its citizens and for the world at large. Jai Hind.
Thank you for your remarks. You did mention some sectors that we are very dependent on China for, such as telecom, APIs. The automotive sector, auto components is another one that has been impacted by trade with China in many ways. If I can bring in Vinny Mehta into this discussion right now. Vinny Mehta is the Director General of ACMA. And before that, he has been involved with IT hardware in India as well. So, Mr. Mehta, how do you see the current situation in terms of, we've been speaking a lot about self-reliance, but over the last 10, 15 years, it's been a big challenge for us in terms of developing our domestic industries in the sectors that you've been familiar with. So can you weigh in, Mr. Mehta?
Yeah, thank you, Anand, for the introduction. And of course, a good morning to all our panelists. I can see some friends here. I think let me demystify the whole thingy in terms of, I hear a lot about the auto component industry's dependence on China, or the automotive industry's dependence on China. Let me put forth some statistics. The size of the automotive industry, the vehicle industry and the component industry taken together is 118 billion US dollars. What we import from China is $4.75 billion. So there's just little, I think it's less than 4% of the overall size of the industry. Why we would import from China? One would import from China if you do not have enough capacity in the domestic market, should the demand be coming in too fast, which is probably not the case at this juncture. We are in a severe downturn. one would import if there is no capability or technology available in the domestic market for certain items, say auto electronics. I heard Gururaj speak about it, or say some regulations like the BS6 came in a little too fast. It was scheduled, it happened in 10 years in Europe. We brought it in 3 years' time. So localization did not happen as it was supposed to be. The third reason could be purely from a price competitive perspective. You must understand, if the Indian auto component industry is 57 billion US dollars, the Chinese auto component industry alone is 550 billion US dollar. It is 10x our size. So the sheer scale allows them to harness economies, and they could be very price competitive. And there's a big lacuna in this country in terms of standards. A lot of the Chinese imports find their way into what is called as the market. For laymen, the aftermarket is that segment of the industry that does servicing and replacement of parts. Now, that market is not very quality sensitive. And unfortunately for us, we do not have prescribed standards for goods sold in the aftermarket. When we sell parts and components to the vehicle industry, we adhere to what is called as the automotive industry standards. These come out of the CMVR, the Central Motor Vehicles Act. But when we sell components in the aftermarket, there are no mandated standards. These are voluntary. Okay, so the consumer is willing to sacrifice quality for price, and as a result of which, a lot of the Chinese imports find their way into the aftermarket. And the fourth reason for import from China is that sometimes companies or global companies have global sourcing strategies, wherein, say, a company headquartered in Germany would identify a certain source in a certain geography and would like all their factories across the world to be supplied from a single source. So these are 4 odd reasons why import happens out of any country, and in this perspective, out of China. And having said that, I think the low-hanging fruit that can absolutely be localized is if we were able to plug the lacuna in terms of lack of standards in the aftermarket. Out of the $4.75 billion import that comes from China, more than 50% goes into the aftermarket. And that could be something we must, and we are actually working with the government on. But having said that, now that there is this, once the lockdowns happened in the aftermath of the COVID that there is an increased realization for all economy industries to be risk averse, to de-risk themselves. And we have been working on deeper localization, as we say it. And the skirmish that happened, the India-China skirmish that happened is only going to precipitate it, it's going to hasten it. So the OEMs and the component manufacturers are working on this, and I'm sure in next 2 to 3 years, you will see a remarkable difference. We as such are a very localized industry. On an average, localization in the automotive industry is more than 70%. And, we are a shining example of Make in India. We were there even before the slogan came in. And I think it's just that we've not been very vocal about it. Now that the Prime Minister has asked us to be very, very vocal, you will hear more of us. With that short note, I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Vinny, for that. Of course, I think one of the big important issues that is the context for all of our discussions today is the political relationship between India and China. Without that, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. If I can bring in Geeta Mohan, who is the Foreign Affairs Editor for India Today. I'm sure you've all seen her on television. And Geeta has been covering the India-China relationship for many, many years now. So Geeta, if you can share your thoughts in terms of how bad is this current crisis vis-a-vis past problems that you've covered in the India-China relationship. Every time there's a crisis, we talk about self-reliance, boycott campaigns. It's happened in 2015, 2017. But obviously, the violence on the boundary was the worst since 1967. So, from your perspective, is this a completely new phase for the relationship? And do you think there's no going back to what the relationship was before 2020, Geeta?
Thank you, Anant, and a very good morning to all of you. Um, Going back, Anant, we've covered India China for many, many years, and we've always seen every time there has been a crisis between India and China that there will be no going back. The last Pangong crisis, the Doklam crisis, certainly were examples where there were many decisions taken and the kind of statements that came from the leadership on both sides clearly showed that there is no going back. But then the informal summits happened. So right now, the coronavirus pandemic and the way and the manner in which the global community has come out and gathered around China to not just contain China. The larger perspective would be the Chinese aggression, which I would be addressing in a bit. Is the reason why we are seeing the kind of statements that is coming not just from the leadership, but like Mr. Mehta said, that right now we see the industries also coming out and strongly opposing the Chinese entry, or for that matter influence or presence in the Indian markets. We've not seen the kind of statements, the kind of positioning that the Indian industrialists have taken this time around in the past. That is a huge shift. It is a shift because in the past, the industries were also very careful, but this time around, we are seeing that there is a certain mandate from the political leadership of the country to take on China. And that's why we are having the kind of conversations that we are having around China. But look at the larger perspective. While we're talking about India, China, in terms of the supply chains, China is not just instrumental or key to the supply chains to products made or manufactured in India. It's a part and a critical part of that of a major global supply chain. So if you're talking about greater gaining market economy or autonomy, do we have the wherewithal and the infrastructure? Now, Mr. Mehta spoke about how of the 118 billion US dollars, around 4.7 billion is what we import from China in terms of components. It's just a small example, but a lot when we speak to these automotive industry representatives, a lot of them say that when they are importing components, when they are sourcing components from manufacturers in India, they name it as Indian manufacturers, but those Indian manufacturers are also importing from China, which is not mentioned. So we need clarity on that as well. The 4.7 does not really reflect the kind of sourcing that Indian companies do from Indian manufacturers who in fact are importing from China. And that's how important and critical China is in this entire play. In terms of the politics, we're looking at the bigger war over here between United States of America and China. India is a player in the bigger US-China war that we're seeing at this point in time. And we've taken a side. We are standing with the United States of America in this war, and we'll have to see what the repercussions and ramifications of that are going to be for India. America is not close. We are connected. We are a neighbor of China, and that's why we feel the impact strategically and militarily as well. And Pangong, the Galwan Valley incident are such examples. But if you see the Southeast Asia picture, most of the countries have come out and spoken very tepidly or very carefully about the Chinese aggressions, including Japan. They've made statements, but when it comes to doing business, they continue to do business with China, which includes Taiwan. We've banned apps. But when it comes to the United States of America, apart from Huawei and ZTE, which are critical for their own businesses, they have not banned any of the apps because that would have meant job losses and loss of employment in the United States of America. We still have to see the US take tough decisions against China. So in this whole global play between US and China, I'd still be wary of whether if we should be as aggressive as we are today with China in the current scenario, looking at it only in a short-term perspective, because 3 months or 4 months down the line, post-coronavirus pandemic, when we start looking at maybe realigning ourselves or doing business with China, how will things look for the markets and for the business houses in India? That's going to be critical and very important.
Thanks very much, Geeta. I think that's an important point to consider for us today. Is it's not just a bilateral trade relationship, given the fact that you're talking about the world's biggest trading nation, second largest economy. So even if you are going to be sourcing from somewhere else, it's very hard to get away from a global supply chain where China is such a big presence. I think with that, if I can bring in Rajul Goel, who's the Secretary General of the Electronic Industries Association of India. And I think that he, more than others, would have an idea of how difficult it is to disentangle yourself from a global supply chain, especially given our electronics industry in India. The fact that even if a lot of assembly is going on in terms of components, we're still importing a lot. So, Mr. Goel, can I bring you into this discussion?
Yeah, sure. I'm somehow not able to unmute myself. Okay, am I audible now? I think
yes, that's fine. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Very good morning. Okay, thank you so much. A very good morning to everyone, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. I think we've heard three of the very good speakers already, and we've got some very good perspectives. I don't think that the data and the information is really hidden now. I think we all know what the data is saying. So looking at that, I really don't think that we have a choice now in the matter that we must reduce our dependence on China, and not only China. I think on imports overall, because we really need to. Otherwise, there is no way that we are going to go ahead in the self-reliance battle that we have just opened up very seriously with the call from the Prime Minister. As we know, the numbers speak for themselves, and I think we have about 15% of our total imports are coming from China, which is definitely a very, very serious thing for us to all think about. And more interesting, alone, working on about $1 billion, and in that $20 billion, the four items which are actually covering about 75% of the total imports of electronics, which is largely the mobile components, and it also includes the semiconductors and the components for computers and computers themselves. So these are the 3 or 4 items which are really a cause of concern for us, and it really it reduces our ability to be able to compete and to even negotiate for that matter. In spite of the fact that we have improved our manufacturing quite considerably in the last 4 to 5 years, and I believe now the number that we have is about $70 billion worth of manufacturing happening locally, which is of course largely also due to the mobile phones. But we still have a lot of as far as the depth of the manufacturing is concerned. So I think our value addition issue remains very serious, and I think till now we have largely been only skimming the market, so to say. So I think we really need to get deep down into this and create policies by which we are able to manufacture more of components and raw materials. I think that is where our real challenge is. We are also having some issues, with respect to FTAs and rerouting of imports. So even if there is something which is not coming directly from China, I think a lot of the raw materials and the inputs are coming through the FTAs, which may or may not always be what it should be, because it is not allowed as per the policy. So people, a lot of importers as well as exporting countries are trying to get and to find a side route into the country, which actually is not right. So I think that is one area where we really need to be focusing. I just heard Vinny say that we have a very low import dependence. I think one of the main the reasons for that is that automotive industry still has some protection by way of customs duty. But we don't have that as far as the electronics industry is concerned, and especially components and the inputs. They are all under ITA1, and they are coming in at zero duty. Is a very big challenge that we need to overcome, and we need to find policies, schemes, and ways by which we can support this industry, because it has a very high capital output ratio. And if we are not able to support them, we will never be able to get really big investments into this area. We are really looking forward to what's happening now with the new NPE 2019, which is the National Policy on Electronics, and some of the schemes which have come in are very, very positive, and we are looking at PLI and specs particularly, which is the production linked incentive, and the second one is for the capital subsidy. We sincerely believe that these two are going to create at least some sort of a virtuous cycle which will start bringing investment. I would like two more points about components particularly. We did an analysis of components, and we found that if we look at the spectrum of components, then PCBs are one of the areas where we are the most dependent on imports, and an equally high dependence is on semiconductors. We have barely 10 to 12% of local manufacturing which is taking care of our local demand, and about 85 to 90% is being imported. These are two areas of very deep concern. We are stronger in some of the areas like electromechanical components and some of the passive components, but still, even there, a lot needs to be done, and it needs very high investment. Closing remark, I would like to say that I think this is not the time for us to indulge in rhetoric and to be really anti-China. I don't think that politics and economics should be mixed too much. I mean, at some point in time, I know they are related, and we can't really and one cannot live without the other. But we must understand that we need a time of strategic planning and of working really hard, on strengthening our value chain. Otherwise, just saying that we're going to throw, Chinese goods out and all, it's not going to work for us, because we have, a very weak economy right now. And if we, start indulging in all this and our current, economic activity does not sustain, then I think we're going to have a lot of trouble. So I think we need to play it very, very carefully here, and we need to work, towards the Atmanirbhar Bharat, but we need to plan and be very resolute about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Raju, and I completely endorse what you said at the end. I think that sometimes we get carried away with the moment without looking at the challenges that lie ahead. And thank you for giving us a very sober perspective. And I think just one example of how difficult the road ahead may be is if you look at MSME sector. Even if you look at China's own growth story and how it became such a linchpin in global supply chains, it was because of China's TVEs, as they used to call it. It wasn't because of big corporations. I think that we aren't going to be able to address any of those issues without first addressing the state of India's MSMEs. And with that, I think we have with us Rajiv Chawla, who is the founder and chairman of the Jairaj Group. And he's also been involved with the Integrated Association of MSMEs of India for many years now. And I think he's very well placed to outline the challenges in this particular sector. Mr. Chawla, can we invite you to join this discussion?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to join the forum this morning and listen to great speakers on a topic that is so hot and so very relevant. I come from the MSME sector, and with my association with MSMEs as IMSME of India founder, I speak for MSMEs, and I focus on the manufacturing sector. But let us understand that we are as much in the same thought process as the large corporates today. And we would also like to see India as self-reliant. And needless to say, that this self-reliance or Atmanirbharta cannot be achieved unless we engage the MSME sector, we strengthen the MSME sector, because that sector till date remains the second largest employer after the agriculture sector in India. And in terms of this strengthening the MSME sector and taking it along is extremely important if the entire nation has to achieve some level of self-reliance and developing an alternate factory to China for the world. But let me also mention that if I divide this era into two, then I believe that it is the time now for the second innings post-COVID. Pre-COVID, we gained two big things. One was experience, and the second was some resources that some large companies actually came to India. And in the automotive sector, we've gained leadership. In IT sector, we have a level of leadership. We're working for the globe. So pharma sector, we're again doing amazing work. So many sectors have gained good strength, built good roots, and there is a lot of potential for them. So the first innings gave us experience and resources. The second innings now that has begun, it calls for two very important things. One is the new age skills or the use of technology hereafter. And second is the innovation and how we can actually enthuse not only domestic markets, but the global markets as well. Because it is only then that India can actually move towards Atmanirbharta. So therefore, if I go back to the basics, all of us in MSME sector or the manufacturing sector, we have to understand that if we compete with China, it's not as simple as banning an app. And in the manufacturing segment, we have to go by QCD, quality, cost, and delivery. And unless we strengthen our core operations in manufacturing in QCD, we won't achieve much. And therefore, we have to go back to the basics. I repeat always that technology will actually never replace entrepreneurs. But entrepreneurs who use technology replace entrepreneurs who do not. And therefore, whether it is Industry 4.0 or it is basic level low-cost automation to achieve some quality standards and higher productivity, this is the time for the entire MSME sector, whether it's in automotive or electronics or whatever, every manufacturing base has to strengthen its tier 1, tier 2. Second important thing is that it is time to speed up the change. The speed of adaptation is extremely important. Once upon a time, it was survival of the fittest. Today, it is survival of the nimble. And if we really have to stand against, and come out in flying colors in manufacturing, we have to hasten the speed of change in the manufacturing sector. And from the government side also, we expect some level of some ecosystem, especially addressed to manufacturing. One thing, of course, is every forum would mention the ease of doing business or the lowering down of the compliances. Compliances for the manufacturing industries in India are huge, humongous. In fact, if every day I recall the number of circulars and notifications that come from different ministries, pollution, finance, GST, state level, labor, employment, ESI, PF, if I look at all these departments and ministries, there are more than 10 circulars that impact every day the life of a manufacturing unit. And therefore, in terms of compliances, we need to give India some level of ease and stability. So this is something for the government to do. Second is that a lot of time we wouldn't even know what exactly are we importing from China. If I look at that, and if I divide it into two, there could be, let us say, some kind of raw materials or high-tech components for which we do not have Indian alternatives today. But then, on the second hand, on the other side, we are also importing furniture, construction equipment, bathroom, sanitary fittings, electrical items. These are the things purely India is importing on the basis of quality and cost competitiveness. And this is not rocket science. And therefore, in terms of the markets, the government should encourage local industries to form clusters of such low technology products, which India can very easily produce, not only for itself, but for the globe. Third thing from the government is that we had a massive national manufacturing competitiveness program, a 10-point program that was launched a few years back. And this 10-point national manufacturing competitiveness program was focused to create strengthening way down the line, especially in government has lost its focus. For example, a fantastic program called Lean Manufacturing Program, which was supported by the Ministry of MSMEs. This program itself has been shelved 3 years back. Then another of the Prime Minister's very ambitious call, the Zero Defect, Zero Effect, and the Z certification program, which was launched across India with huge fanfare in 2014. In 6 years, where is it today? So India, we've lost some focus, some incentives, even from the government side. And therefore, it is important for the government also to realize that if they really want to support self-reliance in the manufacturing sector in India, and if they really want to support manufacturing MSMEs in India, then these things must come out. There is some role for new level institutions. For example, IITs now, they are now collaborating with various units. In fact, of late, we've signed 2 MOUs where one IIT is working with the furnace manufacturers to upgrade their competitiveness, energy consumption, etc. Then there's another IIT that is working with the SMEs in terms of creating new bio-med products that India presently is importing. So these institutions, these technical centers have really to reach out, and we through ASSOCHAM and other bodies, we need to connect these so that the natural progression happens. Lastly, and this is again for the government to understand, and at this forum I would love to highlight it. This 20% emergency loan, the national under the credit management's national credit guarantee scheme, which government announced as a relief measure to the MSME sector in India, giving them 20% of the loan. Even this is not available to a unit if it is more than 100 crore turnover, or if the loan was more than 25 crore. So imagine that in the MSME sector, the medium industry definition was revised from 100 crore to 250 crore, investment revised from 20 crore to 50 crore. But then if a unit has achieved a turnover of more than 100 crore, such a unit is not entitled even to this 20% emergency credit support. So I think we are sometimes discouraging the good SMEs, the good SMEs that have potential to become large corporates, strengthen their economy, and we are not even entitling them to just 20% basic emergency line of credit that everybody deserves in this pandemic time. So I believe that it should not just be the lip talk. Manufacturing sector, if we really have to strengthen, we have to bring institutions play their role. Government has to understand what they can do to create a better ecosystem. And then, of course, the way auto component sector, the OEMs, they have handheld their tier 1 and now tier 2. Some of the largest OEMs have great vendor development programs. ACMA is doing great work with Unido in upgrading the MSME sector, the tier 1, tier 2 in autos component. I think that kind of a role every OEM, every large corporate, every institution needs to.
Thanks so much, Rajiv, for that. I think a lot of food for thought. Of course, the other side of the relationship, we have Indian companies who are in China as well, who've been trying to get market access in China, trying to bridge the trade gap. Someone who's been looking at the two-way relationship, not just in terms of India's reliance, but also India's presence in China, is Mohammed Saqib, who is the Secretary General of the India-China Economic and Cultural Council. And he has worked for many years on boosting engagement between India and China. So I would imagine that this is a particularly challenging time for Saqib and his work. So if you can come in at this stage, Saqib, how is the current situation challenging the kind of engagement we've seen in the past?
Thank you, Anand, and thank you, ASSOCHAM, for organizing such an event and giving me an opportunity. actually, I'm a bit confused that really do we know what we are doing and what do we want at the end of the day? It seems like emotions over economics. You know, all the speakers who have spoken so far, they have elaborated the need of China for our industry and for our development. But we have some kind of emotions about that we are not going to trade with China when we are so dependent on China. I mean, there are certain myths about China which have been propagated all over by web strategic press. Look at this. The biggest thing we keep talking about the trade deficit. I mean, the impact of trade deficit is a myth. Any developing country which is increasing 7 to 8% annually in GDP needs to import. You know, the same industry where we have our highest deficit with China, like pharmaceutical or electronics or machinery or high technology, China still has trade deficit with Japan, Korea, and Vietnam and USA in those particular sectors. This is number one. Number two, boycott China. What alternative do we have? I mean, there are some voices, some associations which are talking with the big, maybe the big players, but SMEs, they have no other alternative. They have been dependent on China for so long that suddenly overnight you decide to ban items, to ban investment. Where do they go? Do they have an alternative? It's not. Number three, in different sectors, we want to be export-oriented country. We want to grow fast. We want to dominate manufacturing in the world. In different industries, from 17 to 34% of foreign value addition of our exports come from China. So how do you do it if you do not bring in those imports from China? Then how do you boost your export? For any export, you have to be competitive. For competitiveness, you need economies of scale. And you cannot have economies of scale just by being in India. You have to be internationally integrated to be competitive. And you are closing all those options. For what? And it is such a knee-jerk reaction that you haven't planned. I mean, everybody knows that, I mean, import from China, some of them are absolutely useless and you can make it like Bhagwan, the small lights, the pen, pencils, the stationery. You can do it. And you must divide your industry at least into three sectors. This is low technology, medium technology, high technology. And give a time frame to that. That for low technology, we will be Atmanirbhar in 3 years. For medium technology, 5 to 7 years. For high technology, 7 to 10 years. And then make policies and physical efforts to do it. You just cannot do it because somebody is angry because of Kalpana not open a all. I mean, economics cannot be a leader rate. And I do not know how these policies are taking shape and in such a crude manner. Even if you want to stop Chinese companies, you do not say that any country which is bordering India, we will stop it. You have so many ways to do it without making it obvious to China. So are we trying to tease them or we are really trying to stop it? You don't have to name countries. You can make a policy, announcement. So the kind of things which are done, the way it is done, I think is not conducive for Indian industry at the moment. Number two, I think Atmanirbharta is a very good idea. Every country should have been Atmanirbhar. We should have been Atmanirbhar by then. But as of today, it looks like Atmanirbhar is the Hindi name of Make in India. And what happened to Make in India? Because we did not really, we just concentrated on slogans. We did not really mean it. And even, unfortunately, after discussing, talking to all these speakers, brilliant speakers, I think Atmanirbhar, the way for Atmanirbhar also goes through China. Even if we want to be Atmanirbhar, we will have to engage with China for some time. in a limited time and in a very, very smart way. We just cannot. The second, which Geeta mentioned, that we just cannot afford to align with any Western country or any country who like China as a people. They are our neighbors. They are strong. We have huge geopolitical and geoeconomic interest by being with China. I mean, what America can announce or UK or German can announce, we cannot announce. I mean, the same policy. We are poor developing countries. We have our different priorities. So we just blindly cannot follow any dictum which seems like anti-China and we should join it.
Thank you, Saki. Can I ask you to conclude, Saki? Yeah, if I can just ask you to wrap up. Thanks.
Okay, that is, I wanted to say that we should be very careful and we should play very smartly and not be emotional about it. Let us be economically strong and then we will see how it is done, the way China had done it with America and Japan for 30 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are running a little bit behind time. So before we come to our last two keynote speakers, let me just bring in Pankaj Mohindru, who is with the Indian Cellular Electronics Association. So Sakib did mention Make in India. So can you explain to us a little bit, 6 years on, what has been the impact? We know a lot of assemblies now happening in India, though, as I understand it, a lot of the components, of course, are still being imported. So can you give us your perspective, Pankaj?
I'll I'll start with a Upanishad shalok, which is very relevant today. Kamya avam pursha ati sa yad kamo bhavati tatkurte bhavati yat kurti bhavate tat karme kurti yat karme kurti tat abhisampadate. You are what your deep driving desire is. What you desire, so becomes your will. What your will is, so is your deed. And what your deed is, that becomes your destiny. So what Geeta alluded to, let me expand that a little bit. What Vinny was saying. You see, aluminium is a critical raw material. And a critical raw material for aluminium is silica, which is almost entirely China's domain. So there will be no component industry, literally the whole component industry comes to a halt if aluminium cannot be produced. So if we peel the onion, this thing, you will see that there is a very, very deep dependence on China because China is the factory of the world. There is no doubt about it. What Sadiq was saying and what Anant, you had asked me that, you see, we were, when Make in India started, we were 80% CBU importers from China. Mobile phone manufacturing has grown 1100% in the last 5 years. We are now producing 2,15,000 crores of mobile phones. Our import is very tiny now. It's about 7,000 crores. We are exporting 27,000 crores of mobile phones. And our component manufacturing is more than 1 lakh crores, right? What Sadiq was saying is a question I ask everybody. What is the import of electronics in China? It is $400 billion. So China is the largest importer of electronics in the world. And we are determined that we should be exporting to China. We already export to China. We should be exporting to China by 2023, 2022. Our target is about $15 billion of exports to China. This is the perspective with which we are working. Well, the government has asked us for a whatever autonomy disengagement program. We are giving 5 strategy papers to the government. One is on general low technology imports, which is not related to us, which can easily be we can easily disengage with China. The first one we've given is on our lowest common technology multiplier, which is feature phones. And it is we can be completely independent of China in the next 24 months, provided we are determined and we are at it. I think this is a wake-up call for India in a way that, we need to develop our manufacturing capability and to make in India really work. What has happened other than mobile phones, our electronic import has ballooned. It is $50 billion now. Out of that, 20 billion comes from China, plus 9 billion comes from Hong Kong. So almost 30 billion out of 50 billion is a China product. Autonomy is a very far cry. We can develop our own sector. When we go higher up, you see, if you look at high-end smartphones, it will be very easy to disengage from China. It's a very surprising thing, but the supply chain of high-end smartphone doesn't touch China too much. It's basically the mechanics and the assembly which is done there, which can shift to India, and the rest of the value chain is essentially Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and American, and German also. But you see, I started off with Sanskrit, but I'll come to Punjabi. There is a saying in Punjabi, ke andheri vangar aanda hai, katte vangar beh janda hai. That he comes like a storm and settles down like dust. Most of our governance is done like that. The gentleman Chawla referred to many programs which were very profound in their thought. But where are they now? They just fritter away. Big announcements, lack of rigor, lack of project management, and they just fritter away. That should not be allowed to happen if we are very serious about that. Coming back to closer home smartphones, the middle category of smartphones, which is India's main market, it is very difficult to disengage from China because China is very deep into this ecosystem. Very, very deep into ecosystem, and even in display, they have made remarkable achievements. Now, semiconductors, which is the heart of the mobile phone or any electronics, memory and baseband processor and other semiconductors, China is not a very major country in that. It's still the domain of other countries. So to that extent, China is going to step up majorly their act how to improve in this sector. And they are very determined, and I think they are going to take a lot of action in that and investment in that. They are putting in $200 billion. Anant, you said about the criticality of MSMEs. I totally disagree with you. World economies are based on large corporations, which is it's a winner take all. The second and third tier suppliers in an ecosystem which is largely large corporations based. And this is the main weakness of the Indian economy, that if you take the US economy, 60% of their economy out of $21 trillion is large corporations. Similarly, China. Okay. India has, as a portion of GDP and as a portion of the Fortune 500 companies, has very few large corporations. And so we are destined for failure if we are not able to build big Indian champion companies. And that should be the first focus. And you see, it's like an engine of growth, and the MSMEs can follow. Of course, there are industries, for example, our add-on industry, which is, the power banks, the car chargers, the covers, and, the fashion accessories. These are almost always in MSME sector. But since the size of the industry is small, an MSME of $50 million turnover is a large company in that sector. So those are industries, but those are tiny industries compared to the main industry. Say mobile phones, $500 billion. The add-on industry, $35–40 billion. So we can have a MSME play there. We are trying to do that. But the important thing is that India should build strong Indian champion companies. And that is what first time in history in India, in the PLI, Indian champions, we have got them recognized as a separate sector, that we have to build Indian champion companies in this sector. And we should do the same in other areas of electronics and other areas of the MSME thing is politically very expedient, because it is because you don't want to take hard action, so just spread something to a large number of people who don't have a voice, etc. So it's good rhetoric, it's good political rhetoric. But the key strategy has to be build big, large global corporations, and your MSMEs then will find way. And when you build that, for example, if I to build
Pankaj, can I just ask you to wrap up in the next minute? Thanks.
If we are able to build, say, a Lava or a Micromax as a big corporation in the entry-level segment in the world, the Indian supply chain will automatically come. Because the Chinese, the Koreans, the Japanese mostly do not allow Indian companies to enter the supply chain. So MSME development is very contingent on this development. So I think these are my points. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Pankaj. A lot of interesting points. Let me come to Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, who, as you know, was India's ambassador to the WTO until 2014. He was previously Secretary to the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Since I'm not sure we might have time for questions, Ambassador Dasgupta, I will hand it over to you for your remarks. And if you could also address some of the questions that have been sent to us to be posed to you, including what India's approach should be more broadly in terms of Chinese investments. Should we be selective? Can we even consider a blanket ban? How do we calibrate this relationship going forward? If you can address that as well. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Anand Krishnan. I must thank ASSOCHAM for inviting me to be a part of the discussion. Without further ado, I'll dive into the subject. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. First thing is that we can't disengage in a knee-jerk reaction from China in terms of either intermediate products or finished products. We have to do it in a gradual way. That point has been made by many of the previous speakers. The next point is about self-reliance. Now, if you look at the Chinese industry and how they have come to dominate the world manufacturing arena, you'll find that they have invested a lot of money in acquiring technology from companies in the West, in Japan, in Korea. They have also reverse engineered and they have done their own research, in which they are investing a huge amount of money. So for the long term, we also need to invest in research and development. We need to borrow, we need to buy, and we need to have our own centers of excellence. And the other related point in this context is that we have to focus on applied research. The basic research part is all right, but applied research which will have a direct bearing on industries, on the manufacturing sector as well as the services sector, that needs to be pushed up. And this cannot be done by the private sector alone. The government has to have a much larger say and a much larger stake in doing this. The second point which the Chinese used was economies of scale. And this brings me to Pankaj Mahindru's point about large corporations. Large corporations today in this world of global value chains, there is a lead firm which helps develop a number of suppliers in the chain. Now, unless you have a lead firm doing it in India, for instance, there are companies which have invested from Korea, from the US, and they want to build up their supply chain within India. Now, that is something which is very welcome, but we must also try to have Indian companies take on that responsibility and that position, or occupy that position. And towards that end, the government support would be required. It is all very well to say that the private sector will take care of all our requirements and they will bring in the capital. Yes, they will bring in the capital. They must put in the money, but the government must also, through its policy prescriptions and concrete action, help in doing that. And towards this end, I think the production-linked incentive scheme for electronics and the mobile phone sector and for the APIs is extremely welcome. We should try to extend it as soon as possible to other strategic sectors in which either there is a problem about suppliers beyond China, or there is something which is of strategic implication for us, including the foreign exchange outflow problem. As you know, the remittances, inward remittances, which India gets about 75 to 80 billion dollars per annum, accounts for a large proportion of the money which helps us offset the current account deficit. This year it is going to go down by 25%. And in the next 2-3 years, if this COVID situation continues, the Middle East, which accounts for a large portion of our inward remittances, will then shrink and we will not have the same kind of comfort. So foreign exchange implications also will have a problem. We cannot but become globally competitive, at least in a few sectors, and start not only exploiting our very large domestic market, but because of our global competitiveness, start exploiting the international trade arena. And the third point that I wanted to mention in this context is about the financing requirements. The banking system in India, 70% of that is the loans that are given are dominated by the nationalized banks. Now, if you look at the availability liquidity, that is in plenty. But if you look at the flow of liquidity, there is a problem. So it is twofold. One, the bankers don't want to take a risk because they are afraid of what would happen to them after a few years' time, especially in the case of the nationalized banks. So this fear needs to be dispelled. And there has to be a concrete mechanism that you can't just leave people to the mercies of the police investigation agencies and let them be charge sheeted and face trial and come up. That is not going to work. The second aspect is about the private sector and foreign investors. Now, if there is going to be a change in the policy environment every other day, and as I think Mr. Raju Goyal or Mr. Chawla mentioned, there is one circular coming out every day about some clearance or some requirement from a regulatory perspective. That is not going to be conducive, so that needs to be stopped. We need to freeze things at a particular stage and say that this is something which will continue for the next 3 years or 5 years, preferably. So this is something which is incumbent upon the government to do. And the private sector must make out a very strong case of a freezing of the policy. It could move in a positive direction, but they should not be going back and taking action on retrospective basis, and especially criminal action. The third point I wanted to mention is that there is a lot to be done still in the matter of ease of doing business. This has been pointed out by the previous speakers. One of the things which has come out is about contract enforcement. Now, if we depend on our present institutions to deliver on this score, we will not be able to rise. We are still at 160, I think, on a global in terms of enforcement of contracts. That needs to improve radically and soon. The last point is about getting the property, the land registered, getting to know whether there is a dispute going on about a particular piece of land outside of industrial areas and acquisition procedures. Now, if the government wants to follow somewhat the Chinese model, we need to have the land which is locked up in the SEZs and industrial areas unlocked and make it available to new investors who are willing to invest their money and come in, whether they are domestic investors or foreign investors. The last point I wanted to mention is about the question that you raised, Anand, and that is about Chinese investments. Now, the figures from the DPIIT, their official website, says that FDI from China has to the extent of about $2.3 billion since April 2002, from April 2000 to March 2020, in a span of 20 years. There are estimates that say that the Chinese have invested in 18 of the 30 unicorns in India, mostly in the technological startup space. There are also other investments which have taken place through portfolio investments and through other investment agencies. So it is very difficult to gauge. There is an ex-finance minister who just a few days ago said that Chinese investments into India could be as high as $26 billion. There are other estimates which say that there could be $8 billion. Be that as it may, as of now, if you take the starting point as 2000 and the end point as 2020, we have received about $470 billion of FDI. Of this, $142 billion have come from Mauritius alone, another $97 billion from Singapore. And we know that there could be other countries or entities involved in routing their investments through Singapore and Mauritius and other countries. Now, having said that, I think it would be perhaps wrong to block the Chinese completely from all investments, but we have not done so. The government has said that the automatic approval route is not available to the Chinese firms, or we can trace back to see the beneficial ownership. If it resides in China, we can stop that or take action. So that is something which we have still kept our doors open for. And the second thing is, China, through investments, we get technology. Now, is China willing to invest in technology or transfer technology in India? As far as the Chinese investments are concerned, if you look at them, apart from the mobile sector and maybe units in a few other sectors, they have not brought in technology, and they're not willing to part with that technology. So to that extent, their investments will only be for making profits and for utilizing the Indian market and the manufacturing ecosystem. So I don't think really that putting certain restrictions on Chinese investments into India will seriously jeopardize India's investment climate. I will stop here. Thank you, Anand.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Finally, let me wrap this discussion up by giving the last word to Sanjay Chadha, who is Additional Secretary in the Department of Commerce. He has worked as Joint Secretary as well. Among his many portfolios, he's been handling international trade with Northeast Asia, including China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the US as well. He's a nodal officer for trade infrastructure and also the chief negotiator with the India-South Korea CEPA review. With that, Mr. Chadha, may I invite you to join the discussion? I think there's been a lot of questions as well regarding government policy in terms of our outlook over the next 4 or 5 years. If you could shed some clarity on that, what degree of interdependence of China are we looking to dilute? What's your sense of how the landscape is going to change over the next couple of years? We would love to hear from you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Anand. Let me just start by congratulating ASSOCHAM on choosing this very topical subject, which is really the flavor of the day, because it's not only just being spoken about in India, but I think post-COVID, everybody is talking about over-dependence on a single source for all your supplies. Now, having said that, let me just start by saying that the global confidence in trade integration started dwindling almost 18 months before COVID struck. It started with the US-China trade dispute, when US tried to decouple, as they call it, from China. Now, having said that, I would just like to say that decoupling is not as simple as the word is made out to be, because in railways, you decouple with the twist of a handle. But when you decouple your global value chains, it is much more difficult. Now, we know that, US had tariffs on Chinese products. Chinese retaliated with counter tariffs on the US products. So what happened? There were two things which started. One was trade diversions, which means that they vacated market space in each other's market. The Chinese products became less competitive in US market and vice versa. The second thing which started was called production relocation. There was a lot of anticipation that if this trade standoff takes a prolonged period of time, then many companies would start diversifying, if not relocating out of China, because China itself is a big market. Well, we did an analysis of all the HS codes at 8-digit level where the US imports from China declined because of the tariffs, and we did a similar thing in the Chinese market. We had gained to an extent, both in the US and Chinese market, but we were woefully short of the market space that had been vacated. We had a lot of industry consultations on why this happened. Why couldn't we fill up more space? A lot of answers came up. One being competitiveness, other being, scales. We just didn't have that much of exportable surplus, which could be ramped up in such a short time. And of course, the major point was that companies felt that we are not sure of the permanence of this sentiment. Would we go back to global supply chains? Or was this just something that was between two administrations and would die its natural death? Now, this sentiment achieved a greater degree of permanence when COVID came in. Post-COVID, this sentiment of having all your eggs in one basket got very highly accentuated, because people started realizing that starting with medical equipment, if you recall, became a major issue. Now, over-dependence on medical equipment and supplies for making medical equipment. Medtronic, the biggest manufacturer of ventilators in the world, was dependent on one country for all its parts. So, this started bringing in a new concept called onshoring or shoring up. Onshoring or shoring up was first talked about by the US, followed by Japan. And if you see what is Atmanirbhar, it's also in effect an onshoring or a shoring up. Now, I'd just like to comment, Anand Krishnan made a very important point. He said that where are we over dependent on electronics and API on China? And I think Geeta Mohan gave the answer to that when she said that there is global dependence on electronics and APIs on China. Now, this is very true. 40% of all electronic production in the world is dependent on China for some supplies. APIs, it's even higher. It's supposed to be almost 59%. Even Europe is dependent on China for its APIs. So yes, there is critical dependence. And as Dr. Jayant Dasgupta said, that some of the schemes, like the PLI scheme, the component manufacturing schemes, are a very welcome step in this direction, because these are the things which will really make us more self-reliant on these very, very critical manufacture. Now, I think I would also like to say that Mr. Vinny Mehta made some very interesting observation. In fact, he said that there is need for standards, to stop substandard import coming in. Now, I couldn't agree more. A decade ago, the challenge was that whenever you tried to enforce standards, there was resistance from the domestic industry. So it's very heartening that today the domestic industry is coming of a maturity where it's welcoming standards. But again, a word of caution, when we enforce standards, a lot of circulars are issued, the so-called circulars which were just being referred to. So yes, if you want to enforce standards, we have to do it in a manner which causes least pain to the domestic industry. At the same time, it is a strong enough deterrent for substandard imports to come in. But matters are more complex. As he himself said, that there are supply chain imperatives. When we talk to some of the industries like textile, they say that our suppliers pick up the sources of our material. So if they say the buttons have to come from this place, then we are left with no option but to import that. Similar is the state with the leather industry. When we talk to all these MSMEs, we say, why do you pick up this particular thing for import? They say it's an imperative of the supplier. Gucci or whoever is the big designer has decided every component from where it will come. So these are really complex natures of the global value supply chain. And decoupling, as some of the panelists mentioned, is not going to happen overnight. We'll have to understand that China didn't build this strength overnight either. It built it over decades. And if we are looking at a decoupling, it will also have to be planned out. When the US-China trade dispute was at its height, the example I like to quote is that the US levied heavy duty of 25% on almost every Chinese product, except its biggest import from China, which was mobile phones. Because it could not have had that Apple was selling phones more expensive in the US and less expensive everywhere else in the world. So that's how complex the global supply chains are. Plus, Apple gets royalties more than China gets production costs. Now, we have to understand that, yes, we need a plug and play. We need schemes to come in. And we need shoring up of critical manufacturing. All these are a given. But there are no easy answers, and there are certainly no easy methods to go about doing it. It's a complex problem because when I was handling China, there were two interesting things, one of which Mr. Mahindru mentioned. In 2016, when I took out the data, we were importing more than 9 billion mobile handsets, $9 billion worth of mobile handsets. The component was under 3 billion. Today, it's more than reverse. We are importing around 11 to 12 billion dollars of components and $3 billion of mobile handsets. Now, yes, the total import has gone up because the components import has gone up. One can argue, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I keep complimenting Matey, the Secretary Matey, that maybe your PMP or phased manufacturing program has played out in this manner, at least to some extent, that you are having assembly of mobile phones here. Now, whether the next step materializes, will we be able to attract a lot of component manufacturer remains to be seen. And here, I'll just like to mention what Mr. Mahindru said, that we have to remember that 43% of exports from China are by non-Chinese companies. So their investments led to the exports. They built their own strengths over a period of time. But their exports started when they had a large number of global MNCs coming and making there because of the competitiveness of manufacturing. So I don't think that there is any shortcut to competitive manufacturing. And I'm surprised that, we have inherent disadvantages of logistic cost. We have inherent disadvantages of high cost of power and other inputs. But these are not as often discussed as maybe tariffs. So you need to take a call that what are we going to concentrate on? Are we going to concentrate on competitive manufacturing or are we going to concentrate on tariffs? Now, Mr. Mahindru again is a Sanskrit Pandit. He's spoken in Sanskrit, he's spoken in Punjabi. So at the risk of sounding blasphemous, I would just take a quote from the Chinese. There is a quote in Chinese which says that when the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build windmills. And if we have to build windmills, it's not just the government. It has to be all of us combined who will have to build this windmill. With these words, I'd just like to say thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chara, for that philosophical conclusion. We unfortunately don't have time for a Q&A, but may I just pose one question to you on the question of windmills and walls? Since you're someone who's handled our trade agreements and trade negotiations as well, what do you think, how would you describe the government's view in terms of India's position in global supply chains? Because you've seen a lot of, I'm sure you've seen a lot of debate and commentary, for example, about withdrawing from RCEP. Is there a contradiction between wanting to get companies to move away from China while at the same time is India taking a not very excited view at global trade? So can you clear that up for us?
Please understand that whenever trade negotiation, it is preceded by an extensive industry consultation. Now, one of the interesting anecdotes I'd like to share with you is that every industry who came here wanted that whatever he's producing should be protected and should not be open to other partner countries for tariff concessions. But he 100% wanted that all the raw material which comes into his production should be opened up and made zero tariff. Now, this goes down the entire value chain of production. So every stakeholder says that I need access to cheap raw material. How do you want me to become competitive? So make sure that whatever is my raw material, it comes from the cheapest country. But make sure that the product which I'm making has a huge wall. Now, this is interesting because the product that he's making goes into raw material for somebody else. So, you know, where do you draw the line is something that's not easy to do. Another thing I realize is that when countries talk of trade, they also have a larger picture in mind. They look at what they are investing in India. Now, when the Koreans and Japanese did FTAs, they wanted something in steel. Why? Because the car auto manufacturers were coming and setting up factories here. So it's an integrated plant. It's not just one-off that you give me a tariff advantage. It's also what is your investment going to be like and what can you drive through your investment. So it's a comprehensive strategy that happens. I hope that answers what you were.
Yes, thank you very much for that anecdote as well. And thank you all for joining us today. I think there's been a lot of things to chew over and take from this discussion. I will just ask Mr. Guru Raj to finally conclude today's event.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. This goes back to what, we've gone full cycle round and come back to what we, had said in the beginning, and that is that India should, bring down its dependence on China is a no-brainer. And I think we all agreed that there is no easy pathway for India to reduce its current dependence, and that the decoupling from China will be a slow, gradual process. But having said that, on a personal note, I want to say a couple of things. I was part of a manufacturing company in Chennai which manufactured the first feature phone, an EMS company. And I was also part of a company that manufactured the most advanced smartphone 12 years later. And things have happened. We have moved forward. And in spite of all the skepticism or whatever doubts there may be about India, things have happened. That's one. The second point I want to make to everybody is, why did Nokia have its biggest factory in the world in Chennai as far as 10 to 15 years back? And at that time, the logistics situation, the customs situation, the tariffs, the duties, everything was probably worse than what it is today. So to me, when there is debate on, whether India is ready for high volume manufacturing, Nokia proved, even 2007-8 timeframe that India is ready. India did perform. The factory in Nokia was one of the best. So I think we need to be less skeptical about ourselves. I think we need to believe that we can do it. We have done it. And, it's not only Nokia. Look at our performance in the pharmaceutical sector. The systems, processes, all the hindrances that we've discussed and we keep discussing have remained. But things have happened also. So I think, it comes back to what Pankaj said in some ways, right? That ultimately a thought becomes your destiny from end to end. And I think the mobile sector has shown that the thought has become our destiny. And my closing comments are that on the rest of all the, in the context of Atmanirbhar Bharat, we can convert our thoughts into destiny. India has been a destination, not because of its weakness, in spite of its weaknesses. India has been a destination in, like I said, the pharmaceutical and various sectors. And I think that needs to get extended to multiple sectors. And I believe the thought of Atmanirbhar Bharat will also get converted into a destiny. Thank you.
Guru, can I shift to Urdu now?
Sure, we've had all languages. Please go ahead.
This is Shakir, vintage.
हाँ
मेरा
जी सर।
अज़्म इतना बुलंद है कि पराए शोलों से डर नहीं, मुझे खौफ आतिशे गुल से है, कहीं वो चमन को जला न दे।
बिल्कुल,
I
Marshall.
think
बिल्कुल सर।
thank you, Mr. Mahindru, for that
That's vintage
closing.
Pankaj for you.
Thank you once again on behalf of
Thank you,
ASSOCHAM. Thanks
everybody.
to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chadda, for enlightening us, Mr. Jain Das Gupta, all the distinguished panelists from the sectoral associations, Mr. Goyal, Mr. Mehta, Geeta ji from the media, for bringing that right perspective. Anand ji, thank you so very much for having a wonderful discussion, moderating very lively discussion. I think the message is to have a calibrated approach, a calibrated strategy. The goal is far ahead, but yes, we have to work towards a self-reliant India, Atmanirbhar Bharat as the long-term goal for us. And thank you once again to each one of you. And I would like to also place on record our thanks to our sponsors, Hiranandani Group, Transport Corporation of India, as well as the Trans Holidays. So thank you once again. I look forward to having more of such discussion. It was a lively discussion, and the topic was very, very contemporary. We have got a lot of insights, though it varied from person to person, but the message is very clear that we have to work towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.